Peter Hitchens is here. Very good morning to you, sir.
Morning.
We find ourselves once again staring down the wrong end of the barrel. We're waiting to see what the currency will fall to and whether anything gets done about it. What's your take on it?
I think the pound is going, before too very long, to fall below parity with the dollar, and I think that will be a very big psychological moment for this country.
You mean like never to return?
I would doubt very much whether it return. I mean, obviously, a lot of this has to do with the Americans jacking up their interest rates, but it also has to do with the relative strengths of the two economies, and ours is not strong. And I think a lot of people outside this country are not particularly confident in the government's ability to actually create the growth it claims it's going to. It's not a method that's generally popular among governments to borrow your way out of recession by and spending an awful lot of borrowed money. Might work. Who is going to sit here and say it will never work? But most of the signs are that it won't, and it has contributed, I think, to this. But in general, we are a declining economy. I think people need to realise just how heavily exposed we are to all kinds of debt, personal and public, and people are beginning to notice. For a very long time, we've had a rather odd free pass. I've been abroad a lot in my life, and almost always I felt rather lucky that most people seem to think that Britain is a solid, stable economy, so I've got a lot of money for my pound. When I lived in the USA, I think I was still getting $2.40, and for most of my life it was $2.80. Before that it was $4 to the pound, and in fact in the pre-First World War era it was $5 to the pound. We were talking earlier about how cab drivers would refer to half a crown, which is 12.5 pence, as half a dollar in the days when a dollar was generally seen to be roughly. Is that more about the strength 5 shillings and 25 pence?
The strength of America's sort of economy rather than the weakness of ours, though?
Partly. It is obviously a relative thing, but I think it does reflect the fact that we have moved in just over a century from having been the financial centre of the world and one of the richest and most prosperous countries in the world with huge overseas assets to a debtor nation. And that's what we are now. And I don't say this out of any exaltation. I just think people in politics and public life should not raise the expectations of people that we can continue to live as we have unless we make very substantial changes. And all evidence points this way, that we are in quite serious trouble unless we make quite major changes in the way we govern ourselves and govern our economy.
And the way that people live now, I was saying this last week before the measures even came in on Friday, before we knew what they actually were from Kwasi Kwarteng, that people now do live a much better existence in terms of what they have, in terms of what they can afford, because they borrow more money. I mean, you see people now driving around in cars, the like of which you would never have seen even 10 years ago. People now get cars that they really can't afford because they've been made affordable.
Well, they've been made affordable by borrowed money.
Yeah.
But you do in the end, you can only borrow money once. You do in the end have to pay it back.
Yeah.
People say, well, governments don't have to, but the problem with governments is that they're not totally sovereign, as we see in the value of the pound. I think part of the reason for the fall in the value of the pound is the realisation among foreign investors and generally among people observing this country from a long way off that we are quite heavily indebted and our economy is not very healthy. You can't carry on doing it without people noticing, and when they notice, then the whole, as it were, the share price of Britain falls.
Yes.
I think to some extent that's what's happening.
Well, one of the indicators for me, and I was told this by somebody this morning who I spoke to in the city, is that the bond market is also tanking, and because people have worked out that the government will have to prop up the bond market, as it were, because they've worked out that they're just borrowing too much money.
Well, it will become more expensive for the British government to borrow. That has been one of the luxuries of being one of the big nations, is that you can borrow more cheaply, and how long will that last? It has worried me for some time, and I take no pleasure in it, but I don't see any great sign in any part of the political spectrum of anybody saying, actually, we need to sort this out in some way or other. And we live beyond our means.
We do.
Country.
But as individuals, I think we do far more as well, because even to go ridiculously back to scenarios whereby when I was a kid, my father would not let me. I wanted to buy a camera once when I was about 14, and the local man in the camera shop said, "Oh, you can get it on HP, hire purchase," which you don't really hear about. And my father said, "No, you can't have anything on hire purchase. You save up the money and then you buy it." And I mean, that is unheard of.
Yeah, well, your father and mine, they came of a generation which had a deep horror of debt.
Yeah, total.
Never contracted debt, never get into debt.
No.
If you did get into debt, then get out of it as quickly as possible. And bankruptcy was a major shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all that has gone now, and people say, well, it's much more relaxed, and look how fast the economy runs and all the wonderful things we can have. But it is always the case. There is always a bill at the end.
Yeah, people go bankrupt now just to avoid paying somebody back.
I'm afraid some people have always done that, but in this, the trouble is it's not something that people worry about, and therefore we move much more towards a debt-based society. And then when the debt is called in, what do we do?
And do you think that the weakness of the economy is due to the fact that we're less of a manufacturing economy now?
I think so. I think it was a great mistake. I think at the time that the manufacturing industry was more or less dispensed with, actually in the years after we joined the European Union, which was one of the reasons why a lot of people in the Labour Party were against joining the common market at the time. Everybody said it doesn't really matter, the manufacturing industry is a thing of the past. I believe that fashionable opinion among economists is shifting back towards the idea that a manufacturing base is quite important.
Right. Well, because we've seen, have we not, the problem of relying on everybody else for what it is that you need, because food now is more expensive because it comes in from abroad. All the things that we buy from China have gone up massively in price because of the cost of shipping it, because the cost of containers apparently has gone up, the cost of shipping has gone up, the cost of fuel has gone up. So everything that we import has become more expensive.
Yes, and also there's the simple point. If you have a large car plant somewhere in southern England which is doing very well, but it's part of a vast foreign empire and the decisions on its future are taken several thousand miles away, there is less likelihood that it will be, as it were, kept going for political reasons. If there's a squeeze, then whatever its home country is more likely to impose that squeeze in Britain than it is in its own territory. So that's also a problem. But I think in general it gives an economy a certain solidity. And
yes, I remember a story.
It's also healthy for a society to have people making things. People actually, if they're working, they feel better if they're making something. And I think
it's a community thing.
We have a lot of social breakdown in areas which used to be manufacturing or mining, where there's a great deal of unhappiness among people who simply haven't got the purpose they used to have anymore. I think
because they don't have a community of people who used to go and work in a big factories. I mean, it's akin to the big steelwork towns in Pennsylvania, isn't it? Where you might not want people to work there, but somebody's got to do it.
Well, I would be happier about this if people could point to me to really satisfactory replacements appearing in these areas for the lost work and the lost work ethic and the lost family strength which went with those industries. If someone else come up with those things, that's fine by me. But as long as they don't,
but they haven't.
I tend to think that manufacturing industry has a point to it.
Yeah, and to your point about sort of over powerful companies and or countries. I remember a story about Ford supposedly going to Harold Wilson's government and saying, we will build a new Ford plant which will make the Ford Fiesta, but we demand this, and this. And they asked for a whole load of sort of tax breaks and all sorts of things. And in the end, they couldn't agree. So they built it in Spain instead.
Yeah, well, that I'm afraid is how multinationals are bound to behave. And almost everything is multinational.
Yes. Shall we talk a bit about what's happening in the Russian scenario?
Well, sure.
This weekend.
I mean, what I tried to say at the weekend is I don't care what people think about this. I mean, anybody, as far as I'm concerned, is free to have any opinion they like, but so am I. And it's perfectly possible for a patriotic person who believes in freedom and is against invasions and believes that all these things are wrong, can also be against the current policy of the British government in stoking the war in Ukraine. Whatever your attitude is towards it, this isn't necessarily a wise policy. It should be being discussed. There should be debates in Parliament where people can say seriously and be listened to without being shouted down, can say, actually, is this the right policy of this country? What is our interest in Ukraine? How is it served by actually sending weapons and money into this war? Wouldn't we, as a responsible major power, be better occupied trying to obtain peace, especially given the terrible, alarming developments in Ukraine in the past actually couple of weeks, in which the possibility of some sort of nuclear exchange has suddenly become real.
Yeah, and you can't rule it out, can you?
You can rule nothing out. I mean, one of the cleverest people in British diplomacy, Sir Ulrich Braithwaite, who was the British ambassador in Moscow, actually, when I was out there for my newspaper, and is one of the sharpest and cleverest diplomats we've ever had, speaks perfect Russian, knows huge numbers of Russians at high level. He wrote to the Times last week saying it's impossible to predict what's going to happen in Moscow now. Putin could disappear overnight. Nobody knows who will replace him if so. Trying to predict it is a job for astrologers. And this is somebody who really knows his onions.
Yeah.
There's a very big problem developing over there, and I think we should be a good deal less gung-ho about it. I also think that the American policy, which is being followed there, of war, and no jaw, is one which is inherently dangerous. And it's not, everybody says, oh, well, if you say that you're Neville Chamberlain, you want to appease. Yes. Actually, it's not true. Right. The person who said jaw is better than war was Winston Churchill. And the person who actually undertook the greatest act of appeasement in modern history, alongside Franklin Roosevelt, was Churchill himself. When at Yalta in 1945, they handed most of Eastern Europe to Stalin. They knew perfectly well that they had no real alternative, because another, as it were, a third European war was intolerable. No one could have taken it. They had to do it. Appeasement is just a rude word for an act of diplomacy you don't like.
Yes, and that is the trouble, isn't it? Because as long as there are people like Putin and countries like Russia, which perhaps operate differently to what we would do, you're not going to change them. They're never going to be different to the way that they are. And so if you said to Vladimir Putin, well, we need to come to some kind of deal, the people who criticise you would say, well, so should he just get away with it? Well, people do get away with things.
Well, they do. And, of course, countries like Saudi Arabia get away with all kinds of things. But it's not just that. I mean, it is the case that a lot of policies adopted by Western countries, particularly by the United States, have helped to create Putin as he is. And among those who opposed the policy of NATO expansion were Russian liberal politicians such as Yegor Gaidar, who we affected to admire. But when he actually went to friends among NATO ambassadors back in, I think, 2004 and said, will you please bring an end to this NATO expansion? It's nothing, it's disastrous. No one listened to him. So actually, did we really want to encourage and help Russian liberals? Because the policy which we followed did the reverse. It helped create Putin-style nationalism and the autocracy which he's now created.
And defence turned into attack. Shall we talk about Gordon Brown and his expurgations this week?
Yeah, I was surprised it got less attention. I mean, the Guardian rightly gave it a lot of attention, but you came out with this report. Among its major recommendations was the end of the House of Lords. Now, I think a lot of people will sympathise with that, because the House of Lords, especially in recent years, has become a complete morass of people. There's so many members.
It's too big, isn't it?
Appointed by various prime ministers for reasons that we won't go into, but for goodness sake, it is a hugely unwieldy and not very impressive body now. Right. Something has to be done, and Gordon Brown has come up with a plan for a kind of elected Senate of some kind, which will be more or less regional in basis. But it's a major constitutional reform, having a second elected chamber in the country, and at the same time, there's a big growth in the Labour Party, the campaign for proportional representation. A lot of unions have switched sides. I don't think it's happened yet. I think a vote is expected this week at the Labour Party conference, which could actually vote in favour of proportional representation. Keir Starmer says that he doesn't want to do it, but on the other hand, is he going to win an election? It's much more likely, it seems to me, that the next election will be hung, in which case he'll have to go to the Liberal Democrats, and they will certainly want PR. I think it's a very real possibility that we could, after the next election, have some of the biggest political reforms that we've seen in terms of the way this country is governed since the Blair years, and maybe even more significant. And hardly anyone's discussing it. They ought to be.
Yes.
It would be a very radical change. A lot of people say, oh, first past the post is clapped out, it's unfair. Yeah. It is unfair. It is old. It has several advantages. One of them, it creates an adversarial parliament where you actually have two parties which don't particularly like each other, which is good for freedom. Yeah. And the other thing is that it means you get strong governments while they're in power, which can then be turfed out and replaced immediately by somebody else if they become unpopular. In PR, it's a constant game of musical chairs in which most of the people always keep their seats.
Yes.
It's very hard to get rid of a government in a proportional
And it's also very
system.
difficult, isn't it, to be in any way ideological, because it almost ends up in some kind of coalition of one kind or another.
Well, it has to be.
And I mean, the problem, I was watching for my sins BBC yesterday morning, at which they expressed some surprise that, you know, the two leading parties in this country have never been further apart, as if that was a bad thing. And I was going, well, sorry, isn't that the way it should be?
If only they were further apart.
Yeah, I wish they were.
I think that of course, on the huge issues, all the great sex, drugs and rock and roll issues, which have actually taken up a huge part of government for the past 40 years, they're much too close together.
Yeah.
And on that, I really could do. I've always said there ought to be what you might loosely call a Daily Mail party versus a Guardian party, and that's the way it would actually represent the divisions in the country. But I'm hugely in favour of an adversarial parliament where there is a lot of fighting and disagreement, and the government never feels safe. I think it's good for freedom.
Yes.
It's good for the way the country is run. If you've constantly got an opposition snapping at your heels, you will govern better.
And do you think Labour's willingness or desire to want proportional representation is based on them losing Scotland? Because without Scotland, they can never really govern properly on their own.
Yes, they've also lost a lot of southern England. You could look at
the north.
Well, there's large parts of the country where Labour simply can't rely on seats anymore, and it is now a very different party from the one which used to win elections outright. I would have thought it's essential for them to do it, and I'm surprised at Keir Starmer being so unwilling to talk about it. But I think he may have to come round. But the problem is, if they don't put it in their manifesto at the next election, then maybe we'll have several referendums, which would be...
I was going to say, so how would it happen
I don't
legally?
know.
I mean, they can't presumably do it without a referendum, can
of course you can. There's no obligation in this country's law to have referendums. The Parliament Act is the ultimate guardian, and the House of Lords, of course, is supposed to be the guardian of the Parliament Act. And that's another reason why House of Lords reform is such an important thing. You would then have, as the final backstop to prevent a government, say, from cancelling the next general election, you then have a chamber which is much more under the control of the party whips.
But would you not then need...
before.
But would you not then need, say, a second reading, or the bill going to the House of Lords in which they would have to vote to abolish themselves?
It's very difficult to see how it can be done. But if the only way you can do anything really is under this unwritten constitution is to win an election with that clearly in your manifesto. In which case the House of Lords has to give into it. What the House of Lords will never give into is legislation which you've cooked up after the election, which wasn't in the manifesto.
Right. Well, Boris Johnson's proved that you can win an election with a massive majority and do hardly anything at all.
Well, that's not...
I mean, I'd like to say... I mean, probably people will say, hang on, there is quite a lot of things that went on behind the scenes that you don't even know about, like the online safety bill and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But he doesn't seem to have done very much.
Well, he would say he got Brexit done, wouldn't he?
Well, he would say that, but that was already
I'm not
done.
saying... I don't want to be a spokesman, but it is what he would say. Perhaps he should get a peerage for that.
Yeah, but that was one thing that was kind of already done before he got in.
I know. We still don't know whether he actually believed in it or not.
No.
But no, it's true. It is a weird...
It is.
The whole era.
Also, do you remember that very odd referendum we did have about the AV?
I remember
business?
it very well, yes.
Because I remember...
nobody knew it was going on at the time.
Back in the old days when we used to sit in much less salubrious surroundings in Hatfields, which you'll remember well.
I remember.
In a little dark studio for Talk Sport. I remember having some Liberal Democrat in to explain how it was all going to work, and I was completely baffled by the system that they were proposing. I don't think anybody really understood what it was.
They did, though. They knew it would be good for them.
Yeah.
And so that's why they pursued it. I mean, these systems are very, very intricate.
Yeah.
But they do tend to help
because there are different versions,
such as the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah, aren't they? Because in Scotland, my understanding is they have the list system whereby you end up getting people elected who you didn't actually vote for because they're nominated by the party.
Yeah, I think it's partly that and partly that. But
you get first past the post
it's
as well.
It's a mixture. And I think the London Assembly is done on the same basis.
Right, I think so.
And we have the weird thing in London as well of the only part of Britain which has an elected president, and the mayor is they have other mayors in the country, but they don't have the same power as the London mayor. The mayor of London is directly elected as if he were a president in a non-monarchical country. It's very strange.
Well, I think he certainly sees himself as the president of London.
He's not answerable to the Assembly, and that's the huge difference.
Right.
And you could tend to... I just think that we are on the edge in this country, in this new reign, of a huge number of major changes in the way in which we're governed. And people should be on the alert for them. You may like this, but you would think very carefully, because a lot of these things don't show their true character until they come into existence.
Certainly those people from UKIP back in the day were probably quite right to be miffed at the idea that they'd got a reasonably large number of people voting for them, and then you got one seat.
It's the price you pay.
Yeah.
But I think if you wanted reform, what you would do, you would reform the campaign contributions so that dodgy billionaires couldn't keep parties going. You get rid of state aid parties so that corpse parties couldn't keep going. And you changed the broadcasting rules, which at the moment give a huge edge to the existing parties and cut out any challenger parties coming in. Those reforms would keep first past the post going and modernise it, and quite possibly be the midwife for new political parties, which I think this country very badly needs.
I think so.
Both the two major parties seem to me to be more or less corpses representing groups of people in London and practically nobody else. But they carry on collecting the tribal votes of the parties they used to be. And that's the problem. Something needs to be done to separate them from those tribal votes and get those people voting for parties which really represent them.
Yes. Well, we shall see. There'll be a long conversation, I'm sure, and we'll have it for many, many years to come. Peter, thank you very much indeed. As ever, Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday column, of course. It's out there. You can read it on Twitter. You can find it on Twitter. You can find it on their website as well.